For 15 years, the city librarian had recommended the perfect crime novel to every patron. "How do you always know exactly what I'll love?" they'd ask. She'd just smile and say, "I understand criminal minds." They thought she meant fictional ones, until a real serial killer started targeting her library patrons, and Dr. Sarah Chen realized the pattern she'd been unconsciously tracking wasn't from a book, it was happening in real life, and she was the only one who could stop it. Welcome to the SOLDİER Stories. Before we begin this gripping tale of hidden expertise and the thin line between fiction and reality, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button and help us honor the protectors hiding in plain sight. The Riverside Public Library stood as a beacon of knowledge in downtown Portland, its neoclassical facade housing one of the most comprehensive collections in the Pacific Northwest. Built in 1923 and renovated multiple times over the decades, it maintained the perfect balance between historic charm and modern functionality. The main reading room featured soaring ceilings, tall windows that bathed the space in natural light, and rows of oak tables where students, researchers, and casual readers spent their days immersed in books. The crime fiction section occupied a prominent corner on the second floor, its shelves meticulously organized and constantly updated with the latest releases from major publishers and independent presses alike. Dr. Sarah Chen had been the head librarian for 3 years, ever since moving to Portland for what she told everyone was a career change. At 45, she possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of literature that impressed even the most demanding patrons. Her recommendations were legendary among regular visitors. She had an uncanny ability to match readers with exactly the right book, particularly in the realm of crime fiction and psychological thrillers. Sarah's office, tucked away behind the reference desk, was spartanly decorated. A few framed library science certificates hung on the walls, along with a single photograph of her receiving her master's in library science from the University of Washington. What visitors couldn't see were the boxes of books and files stored in her basement at home, remnants of a previous career she had worked hard to leave behind. The library served a diverse community of approximately 50,000 residents. Regular patrons included college students from nearby Portland State University, retirees seeking intellectual stimulation, working parents grabbing quick reads during lunch breaks, and a dedicated core of mystery and crime fiction enthusiasts who had formed an informal reading group that met monthly in the library's community room. Sarah knew them all by name, understood their reading preferences, and had built relationships that went far beyond simple book recommendations. She remembered personal details, inquired about family members, and provided a level of service that made the library feel more like a community center than an institutional building. What none of them knew was that Sarah's ability to recommend the perfect psychological thriller wasn't just based on literary knowledge. It came from 20 years of creating real psychological profiles of the most dangerous criminals in America. Dr. Sarah Chen had joined the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit in 1998, fresh out of a doctoral program in forensic psychology at Georgetown University. For 2 decades, she had been one of the Bureau's most successful criminal profilers, specializing in serial killers and sexually motivated crimes. Her career had been distinguished by several high-profile cases that had made national headlines. She had helped capture the Interstate Strangler, a serial killer who had terrorized the Eastern Seaboard for 3 years. Her profile of the campus killer had led to the arrest of a university professor who had murdered 7 graduate students across 4 different states. Her work on the Family Annihilator case had earned her recognition from the director of the FBI himself. Sarah's approach to criminal profiling combined rigorous academic training with an intuitive understanding of human psychology that had made her invaluable to law enforcement agencies across the country. She could look at a crime scene and immediately begin constructing a mental picture of the perpetrator, their age, background, psychological state, and likely next moves. Her colleagues respected her intellect and her results, but they also knew that the work was taking its toll. 20 years of diving into the darkest corners of human nature, of thinking like killers in order to catch them, had left Sarah emotionally exhausted and psychologically scarred. The breaking point had come during the Riverside Ripper case. In 2018, a serial killer had been targeting families in suburban communities, and Sarah had spent months developing a comprehensive profile. She had identified the killer's psychological triggers, predicted his escalation pattern, and even narrowed down the geographic area where he likely lived. But the profile had been wrong, not completely wrong. She had been accurate about many details, but she had missed a crucial element of the killer's psychology, and that oversight had led to a tactical error during the arrest attempt. The killer had escaped, and in the process he had murdered 2 more people, including a 8-year-old girl named Emma Rodriguez. The case was eventually solved and the killer was captured and convicted, but Sarah couldn't forget that her mistake had contributed to Emma's death. The guilt and trauma of that case, combined with 2 decades of accumulated psychological strain, led to her decision to leave the FBI in 2019. She had moved to Portland, specifically because it was far from the East Coast, where most of her cases had been concentrated. She chose library science as her new career because it represented the opposite of her FBI work. Instead of analyzing darkness, she would be helping people access knowledge and light. For 3 years, the strategy had worked. Sarah had found peace in the quiet routine of library work, in helping patrons find exactly the book they needed, in organizing community events and maintaining the collection. She had convinced herself that she was happy with her new life, that she didn't miss the intellectual challenge and adrenaline rush of criminal profiling. But some skills, once learned, are impossible to completely suppress. Sarah's reputation for uncannily accurate book recommendations had developed gradually over her 3 years at the library. It started innocently enough. She had always been a voracious reader, and her FBI background had given her extensive familiarity with crime fiction as both entertainment and potential insight into criminal psychology. When patrons asked for reading suggestions, Sarah found herself automatically analyzing their personality types, their psychological needs, and their likely preferences based on behavioral cues she had been trained to notice. A nervous, detail-oriented accountant might appreciate the methodical procedural approach of a police detective novel. A creative writing student might be drawn to the psychological complexity of a character-driven thriller. A recently divorced patron might find catharsis in a story about justice and closure. What made Sarah's recommendations so effective was that she wasn't just matching books to reading preferences. She was unconsciously profiling her patrons and selecting stories that would resonate with their psychological states and emotional needs. Mrs. Peterson, a 62-year-old retired social worker, always requested books with strong female protagonists who solved problems through intelligence rather than violence. Sarah recommended authors like Louise Penny and Tana French, whose complex characters and psychological depth appealed to someone who had spent her career understanding human nature. David Kim, 28-year-old software engineer, preferred fast-paced thrillers with technological elements. Sarah guided him toward authors like Michael Crichton and Daniel Suarez, whose combination of cutting-edge science and suspenseful plotting matched his analytical mindset and professional interests. Jennifer Walsh, a 35-year-old single mother, working 2 jobs, needed escapist fiction that provided emotional satisfaction without being too psychologically heavy. Sarah recommended cozy mysteries and romantic suspense novels that offered entertainment without triggering stress about real-world dangers. Over time, patrons began to seek out Sarah specifically for recommendations, and her suggestions became so accurate that people started joking about her supernatural ability to match readers with the perfect book. "It's like she can read our minds," Mrs. Peterson told her book club. "She understands what we need better than we do." David Kim posted in an online forum about the library. "I swear she's psychic or something," Jennifer Walsh told her sister. What they didn't realize was that Sarah was reading their minds. In a sense, she was applying 20 years of behavioral analysis training to understand their personalities, motivations, and psychological needs, then using that information to select books that would satisfy those specific requirements. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that she had become more successful at understanding people's reading preferences than she had been at predicting criminal behavior in her final FBI case. But she told herself that this was different. This was using her skills to help people find joy in entertainment, not to hunt killers. Until the day when those two worlds collided. The first incident seemed like a coincidence. Mrs. Peterson failed to show up for her Tuesday morning visit to the library, breaking a routine she had maintained for over 2 years. When she missed her second consecutive Tuesday, Sarah felt a nagging concern that she couldn't quite explain. Sarah tried calling the phone number Mrs. Peterson had provided when she signed up for her library card, but the call went straight to voicemail. She considered driving to Mrs. Peterson's address to check on her, but talked herself out of it. She was a librarian, not a police officer, and Mrs. Peterson was an adult who had every right to change her routine without explaining herself to anyone. 2 weeks later, David Kim also stopped coming to the library. He had been a regular visitor for over a year, typically arriving every Saturday morning to browse the new releases and work on his laptop in the quiet study area. When he missed his 3rd consecutive Saturday, Sarah began to feel genuinely worried. She pulled David's contact information from the library database and tried calling him as well. Like Mrs. Peterson's phone, his went directly to voicemail. Sarah left a message saying that the library had received some new books she thought he might enjoy, and asking him to call her back. He never did. The 3rd disappearance was what triggered Sarah's professional instincts. Jennifer Walsh had been coming to the library every Friday afternoon for 6 months, usually bringing her 80-year-old daughter Emma to participate in the children's reading program while Jennifer browsed the mystery section for her weekend reading. When Jennifer failed to appear for 2 consecutive Fridays, Sarah's concern escalated to alarm. Jennifer was a single mother working multiple jobs. She depended on the library's free childcare during the reading program to give herself a brief respite. It was completely out of character for her to simply stop coming without explanation. Sarah tried calling Jennifer's number, but like the others, it went straight to voicemail. This time, however, Sarah's concern overcame her reluctance to get involved. She looked up Jennifer's address in the library database and decided to drive by her apartment building to see if everything was okay. Jennifer's apartment was in a modest complex on the east side of Portland. Sarah parked across the street and observed the building for several minutes, trying to decide what to do next. She was about to leave when she noticed that Jennifer's mailbox was overflowing with uncollected mail, a clear sign that no one had been home for several days. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. 3 regular patrons, all of whom she had developed personal relationships with, had vanished without explanation within a span of 6 weeks. Each had simply stopped coming to the library and stopped answering their phones. Their disappearances might be unconnected people moved, changed their routines, had family emergencies that required them to travel. But Sarah's 20 years of FBI training had taught her to recognize patterns, and this felt like a pattern. She spent the weekend reviewing everything she could remember about Mrs. Peterson, David Kim, and Jennifer Walsh. Their ages were different, 62, 28, and 35. Their backgrounds were completely different. Retired social worker, software engineer, and single mother. They lived in different neighborhoods and had different social circles, but they had all been regular library patrons. They had all sought reading recommendations from Sarah, and they had all disappeared within a 6-week window. By Monday morning, Sarah had made a decision that she knew would change everything. For the first time in 3 years, she was going to think like an FBI profiler again. Sarah's first step was to create a comprehensive profile of each missing patron, using the same systematic approach she had employed in hundreds of FBI cases. She pulled their library records, reviewed their reading preferences, and reconstructed her interactions with each of them over the past several months. Mrs. Peterson, 62-year-old retired social worker, widowed for 8 years, lived alone in a small house in the Hawthorne district. No children, few close friends, limited social connections outside of her book club and weekly library visits. Preferred psychological mysteries with strong female protagonists. Last book checked out in the woods by Tana French. Last seen, Tuesday, September 5th. David Kim, 28-year-old software engineer. Recent transplant to Portland from San Francisco, worked remotely for a tech startup. Single, introverted, spent most of his free time reading or working on personal coding projects. Preferred tech thrillers and hard science fiction. Last book checked out, Demon by Daniel Suarez. Last seen, Saturday, September 9th. Jennifer Walsh, 35-year-old single mother, worked as a night shift nurse at Providence Hospital and part-time retail at a clothing store. Divorced, limited family support, depended on library programs for childcare. Assistance, preferred escapist fiction and romantic suspense. Last book checked out, The Thursday Murder Club by Richard Osman. Last seen Friday, September 15. As Sarah reviewed the details, a pattern began to emerge that chilled her to the bone. All 3 missing patrons were socially isolated individuals, with limited family connections and predictable routines centered around the library. They were exactly the type of victims that predatory criminals typically targeted, people whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed or reported. But there was another, more disturbing pattern. Each of the missing patrons had consulted with Sarah about their reading preferences within 2 weeks of their disappearance. Mrs. Peterson had asked for recommendations for psychological thrillers with unreliable narrators. David Kim had requested books about surveillance and privacy invasion. Jennifer Walsh had inquired about stories where single mothers have to protect their children from danger. Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized what this might mean. If someone was targeting her patrons, they might be using her book recommendations to identify potential victims and understand their psychological vulnerabilities. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah opened the locked filing cabinet in her home office and retrieved her FBI credentials and badge. Then she picked up her phone and called a number she hadn't dialed since leaving the bureau. Special Agent Marcus Rodriguez, Behavioral Analysis Unit. Marcus, it's Sarah Chen. I need your help. Special Agent Marcus Rodriguez had been Sarah's partner for the last 5 years of her FBI career. They had worked together on dozens of cases, and Marcus had been one of the few people who truly understood why Sarah had needed to leave the bureau after the Riverside Ripper case. Sarah, Jesus, it's good to hear from you. How are you doing? How's the library life treating you? Marcus, I think I have a problem. 3 of my regular patrons have disappeared over the past 6 weeks, and I think they might be connected. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Marcus knew Sarah well enough to recognize when she was operating in profiler mode. Tell me everything, he said. Sarah spent the next hour walking Marcus through her analysis of the 3 disappearances, the patterns she had identified, and her growing suspicion that someone was using the library to identify and target victims. Marcus listened without interrupting, occasionally asking clarifying questions about timelines and details. When Sarah finished, he was quiet for several minutes. This sounds like a serial killer in the victim acquisition phase, he said finally. The targeting of socially isolated individuals, the use of the library as a hunting ground, the escalating timeline, it all fits the profile. That's what I'm afraid of, Sarah replied. But I need law enforcement involved before anyone else disappears. Can you help me make contact with the local field office? I can do better than that. I'm actually in Portland right now, working on a joint task force investigating a series of missing persons cases across the Pacific Northwest. What you're describing might be connected to our case. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and dread. Relief that her concerns were being taken seriously, and dread that her worst fears might be confirmed. How soon can we meet? She asked. I can be at your library in 2 hours, but Sarah... If this is what we think it is, you need to be prepared for the possibility that you're going to have to become an FBI profiler again, at least temporarily. Sarah looked around her quiet home office, at the library science textbooks on her shelves, and the peaceful life she had built over the past 3 years. She knew that once she stepped back into the world of criminal profiling, there might be no going back. I know, she said. But if someone is using my library to hunt people, I can't just ignore it. No, Marcus agreed. You can't. The FBI field office in Portland was located in a modern glass building downtown, a stark contrast to the historic charm of the library where Sarah spent her days. As she walked through the security checkpoint and rode the elevator to the 12th floor, she felt the familiar mixture of anxiety and anticipation that had defined her 20 years with the Bureau. Marcus met her in the lobby, and Sarah was struck by how little he had changed in the 3 years since she had left. Still tall and lean, with prematurely gray hair and the intense eyes of someone who had seen too much human darkness. His embrace was warm but brief. They were here on business. The task force is already assembled, Marcus explained as he led her down a corridor lined with generic government offices. We've been tracking a series of disappearances across Oregon, Washington, and Northern California for the past 8 months. Adults with no history of mental illness or substance abuse, no financial problems, no apparent reason to disappear voluntarily. He stopped at a conference room door and turned to face Sarah before they entered. I need to warn you that this case has some similarities to Riverside Ripper, not in terms of the killer's methods, but in terms of the victim selection and the psychological profile. I know that case was difficult for you, and I want to make sure you're ready for this. Sarah took a deep breath. The Riverside Ripper case had nearly destroyed her, but it had also taught her valuable lessons about the limits of criminal profiling and the importance of considering multiple possibilities. I'm ready, she said. The conference room contained 6 people seated around a large table covered with files, photographs, and maps. Marcus introduced Sarah to the group: FBI Special Agent Lisa Park from the Portland Field Office, Detective James Sullivan from Portland Police, Detective Maria Santos from Seattle PD, Detective Robert Chen, no relation, from the Sacramento Sheriff's Department, and Dr. Michael Foster, a forensic psychologist who consulted with law enforcement agencies throughout the region. Agent Park, a woman in her early 40s with short black hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, served as the task force coordinator. She gestured for Sarah to take a seat and began briefing her on the case. Over the past 8 months, we've documented 23 disappearances across 3 states that appear to be connected. Agent Park began. The victims range in age from 24 to 67, include both men and women, and come from diverse ethnic and socioeconomic backgrounds. She handed Sarah a thick folder containing victim profiles and case summaries. What they have in common is that they were all socially isolated individuals with limited family connections and predictable routines. They disappeared without a trace, no signs of struggle, no financial activity after the disappearance, no communication with friends or family. Detective Sullivan, a veteran police investigator with 25 years of experience, leaned forward in his chair. We've been working this case for 6 months without making significant progress. The victims seem to be selected randomly, and we haven't been able to identify any connection between them or any pattern in the locations where they disappeared. Dr. Foster, the forensic psychologist, opened his own folder and pulled out several documents. Based on the evidence we have, we're dealing with a highly organized serial killer who is extremely careful about victim selection and disposal. This isn't someone acting on impulse. This is a predator who plans meticulously and covers his tracks. Sarah reviewed the case files while the team continued their briefing. As she read through the victim profiles and case details, she began to see patterns that the task force might have missed. Has anyone looked into whether any of these victims frequented libraries or bookstores? She asked. The room went quiet. Agent Park exchanged glances with Detective Sullivan. Why do you ask? Agent Park said. Sarah explained her theory about the connection between her missing patrons and their library usage, and her suspicion that the killer might be using libraries as hunting grounds. If someone wanted to identify socially isolated individuals with predictable routines, a library would be an ideal place to conduct surveillance, Sarah continued. Regular patrons often visit on the same days at the same times. Librarians interact personally with patrons and have access to their contact information and reading preferences, and libraries serve communities where people might know each other by sight but not have deep personal connections. Dr. Forster was taking notes rapidly. That's an excellent insight. It would also explain why we haven't been able to identify connections between the victims. They might not have known each other directly, but they could have been selected from the same hunting ground. Agent Park was already reaching for her phone. I'm going to have our field officers check the library usage of every victim on our list. If Dr. Chen is right, this could be the break we've been looking for. Marcus looked at Sarah with the expression she remembered from their partnership days, the mixture of admiration and concern that appeared when she had made a breakthrough that might put her in danger. Sarah, if the killer is using libraries to select victims, and if your patrons are part of his target pool, then he might have already identified you as someone with access to potential victims. The implication hit Sarah like a physical blow. If her theory was correct, she wasn't just a witness to a series of crimes, she might be an unwitting accomplice, providing the killer with information about potential victims through her book, recommendations, and personal interactions with patrons. And if the killer realized that she had figured out his pattern, she might become a target herself. Over the next several hours, Sarah worked with the task force to develop a psychological profile of their suspect, using her 20 years of experience and the new information about the potential library connection. She began to construct a picture of the killer's personality, motivations, and likely behavior patterns. We're dealing with a highly intelligent and organized individual, Sarah began, falling back into the familiar rhythm of presenting a criminal profile. The careful victim selection, the absence of physical evidence, and the geographic spread of the crimes indicate someone with extensive planning capabilities and the resources to travel frequently. She stood at the whiteboard where the team had mapped out the locations and timelines of the disappearances, pointing to specific patterns as she spoke. The victims are all socially isolated individuals, but they're not chosen randomly. They're selected based on specific criteria that reduce the risk of immediate detection. People who live alone, have limited family connections, and maintain predictable routines that make them easy to monitor and approach. Dr. Forster nodded in agreement. The psychological profile suggests someone with antisocial personality disorder, possibly with narcissistic traits. The level of control and organization required for these crimes indicates a person who feels superior to both his victims and law enforcement. Sarah continued building the profile. If the killer is using libraries as hunting grounds, he's likely someone who can blend into that environment without attracting attention. Probably well-educated, possibly with a professional background that gives him access to institutional settings. He might work in education, social services, or another field that involves regular interaction with the public. Detective Santos, who had been reviewing the victim files, looked up from her notes. The age range of the victims to 24 to 67 suggests that age isn't a primary selection criterion. He's looking for vulnerability and isolation rather than specific physical characteristics. Exactly, Sarah agreed. This isn't a sexually motivated killer targeting a specific victim type. This is someone who derives satisfaction from the act of control and domination itself. The killing is secondary to the psychological gratification he gets from the selection, stalking, and capture process. Agent Park was taking detailed notes. How would he approach the victims? What's his likely method of initial contact? Sarah considered the question carefully. Given the library connection, he might present himself as someone with legitimate reasons to be in that environment. A researcher, a book club organizer, someone conducting surveys or interviews. He would need to establish enough trust to get the victims to voluntarily go with him or provide him with personal information. Marcus, who had been quietly observing Sarah's return to profiling work, asked the question that everyone was thinking. What's his endgame? Is he building up to something, or is this pattern sustainable long-term? Sarah looked at the timeline of disappearances mapped out on the board. The intervals between victims had been gradually decreasing over the 8 period, from 6 weeks between the first 2 disappearances to less than 3 weeks between the most recent ones. He's escalating, she said quietly. The decreasing time interval suggests that he's either becoming more confident or that the psychological satisfaction he derives from each crime is diminishing, forcing him to act more frequently to achieve the same emotional payoff. The room fell silent as the implications of Sarah's analysis sank in. They weren't just hunting a serial killer. They were racing against a rapidly accelerating timeline that suggested the killer was building toward some kind of culmination. How much time do we have? Agent Park asked. Sarah studied the timeline again, calculating the intervals and the rate of acceleration. Based on this pattern, he's going to need another victim within the next 7 to 10 days. And given that 3 of my library patrons have already disappeared, there's a strong possibility that he's going to return to my library to select his next target. Marcus immediately understood what Sarah was suggesting. You want to use yourself as bait. It's the most logical approach, Sarah replied. If he's been monitoring the library and has identified me as someone with access to potential victims, he might approach me directly. I can maintain my normal routine while wearing a wire and having surveillance backup. Agent Park was shaking her head before Sarah finished speaking. Absolutely not. We're not putting a civilian in that kind of danger, especially someone without current law enforcement training. I'm not a civilian, Sarah said firmly. I'm a former FBI agent with 20 years of experience in exactly this type of case, and I'm the only person who has detailed knowledge of the library environment and the patron community. The debate continued for another hour, with team members arguing about the risks and benefits of using Sarah as an undercover asset. Eventually, Marcus proposed a compromise that satisfied everyone's concerns. What if Sarah returns to her normal routine at the library, but we station undercover agents as patrons and maintain constant surveillance? She doesn't actively engage with potential suspects, but she serves as a visible presence that might draw the killer out of hiding. Agent Part considered the proposal. We'd need full bureau authorization for an undercover operation of that scope, and Dr. Chen would need to be officially reactivated as a consultant to provide legal coverage. Sarah felt a familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension. 3 years ago, she had walked away from the FBI convinced that she never wanted to profile another criminal or hunt another killer. But sitting in this conference room, surrounded by law enforcement professionals working to stop a predator, she realized that she had never really stopped being an FBI agent. She had just been taking an extended leave of absence. "I'll do it," she said. The next morning, Sarah returned to the Riverside Public Library for what felt like the first time. Even though she had been working there for 3 years, everything looked the same. The familiar oak tables, the sunlight streaming through tall windows, the carefully organized shelves of books, but she experienced it all with the heightened awareness of someone conducting an undercover operation. Agent Park had positioned for undercover FBI agents throughout the library, each playing the role of typical patrons. Agent Johnson posed as a graduate student researching his dissertation in the periodicals section. Agent Williams appeared to be a retired teacher browsing the large print fiction collection. Agent Thompson sat at a computer terminal pretending to search for jobs online. Agent Davis worked in the children's section, posing as a young mother supervising her toddler during story time. Sarah wore a nearly invisible wire transmitter that allowed the surveillance team to monitor her conversations, and she carried a panic button disguised as a library name tag. Agents Park and Rodriguez coordinated the operation from a surveillance van parked across the street, with backup units stationed at strategic locations around the building. The plan was for Sarah to maintain her normal routine while remaining alert for any patrons who seemed to be paying unusual attention to her interactions with other library visitors. The team had provided her with photographs of men who matched the general profile they had developed, but they acknowledged that the killer might not fit their expectations. For the first 3 days, nothing unusual happened. Sarah helped patrons find books, organized new acquisitions, and conducted her normal administrative duties while the undercover agents maintained their surveillance. A few regular patrons commented on her apparent nervousness, but she attributed it to stress from budget meetings and administrative responsibilities. On Thursday afternoon, Sarah was working at the circulation desk when she noticed a man she hadn't seen before browsing the crime fiction section. He appeared to be in his early 40s, well-dressed in business casual clothes, with the kind of unremarkable appearance that would make him easy to overlook in a crowd. What caught Sarah's attention wasn't his appearance, but his behavior. Spent an unusually long time examining specific books, frequently glancing toward the circulation desk where Sarah was working. When other patrons approached the crime fiction section, he moved away and returned when they left, as if he wanted to avoid being seen by too many people. After nearly an hour of this behavior, the man selected a book and approached Sarah's desk to check it out. As he handed her his library card, Sarah noted that his hands were soft and well manicured, not the hands of someone who performed manual labor. "Finding everything okay?" Sarah asked, scanning the book's barcode while discreetly reading the name on his library card, Robert Morrison. "Yes, thank you. You have an excellent crime fiction collection. Very comprehensive." Sarah handed him the book and receipt, noting that he had selected Mindhunter by John Douglas, a non-fiction book about FBI criminal profiling techniques. "I hope you enjoy it." John Douglas is one of the pioneers of criminal profiling. Very insightful look into how law enforcement tracks serial killers. Robert Morrison's eyes sharpened with interest. "You seem very knowledgeable about criminal psychology. Have you studied it professionally?" The question sent alarm bells ringing in Sarah's mind. Most library patrons didn't probe into librarians' educational backgrounds, especially not in connection with criminal psychology. "Just a personal interest," Sarah replied carefully. "I read a lot of crime fiction and non-fiction. Part of being able to make good recommendations, I imagine you get to know your regular patrons quite well. Their reading preferences, their personal interests. To some extent it helps with providing better service." Morrison nodded slowly. "I'm new to the area and looking to meet people with similar interests. Do you have any book clubs or discussion groups focused on crime fiction?" Sarah's profiler instincts were now fully activated. The conversation felt like an interview, as if Morrison was gathering information about her knowledge of criminal psychology and her access to library patrons. "We have a monthly mystery book club that meets the first Thursday of every month. The next meeting is next week if you're interested." "That sounds perfect. Will you be attending?" "I usually do. I help facilitate the discussions." Morrison smiled, and Sarah noticed that the expression didn't reach his eyes. Excellent. I look forward to seeing you there. After Morrison left, Sarah immediately signaled Agent Johnson, who had been observing the interaction from the periodicals section. Within minutes, Agent Rodriguez's voice came through her earpiece. Sarah, we got all of that. Agent Williams is following Morrison to see where he goes. Can you pull up his library registration information? Sarah accessed the library database and pulled up Robert Morrison's account. The address listed was for an apartment complex on the east side of Portland, the same general area where Jennifer Walsh had lived. The phone number had a local area code, and the registration date was only 2 weeks old. Marcus, his account was just created 2 weeks ago, right around the time Jennifer Walsh disappeared, and his address is in the same neighborhood. We're running his name and address through our databases now. Keep acting normal, but don't engage with him if he comes back before we have more information. The rest of the afternoon passed without incident. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Robert Morrison's visit had been more than just a casual library interaction. His questions had been too specific. His interest in her knowledge of criminal psychology too pointed. That evening, Agent Park called Sarah at home with an update. Robert Morrison doesn't exist. The name and address on his library card are fake. There's no apartment 304 at that address. And the phone number belongs to a disconnected cell phone. The credit card he used for registration was also fake. Sarah felt her heart racing. So, he specifically created a false identity to access the library. It looks that way. We're reviewing security camera footage to get a better image of him. And we're checking to see if anyone matching his description has been seen at the libraries where other victims were last spotted. What about the book club meeting? He seemed very interested in attending. Agent Park was quiet for a moment. We think that might be where he plans to make his move. A book club meeting would give him access to multiple potential victims in a setting where he could gather personal information and identify the most vulnerable targets. So we're going to use the meeting as a trap. We're going to be ready for anything, Agent Park replied. But Sarah, I want you to understand that this man has killed at least 23 people, and he's escalating rapidly. If he's targeting you specifically, this could be extremely dangerous. Sarah looked around her quiet home, at the peaceful life she had built over the past 3 years. She thought about Mrs. Peterson, David Kim, and Jennifer Walsh, people who had trusted her recommendations and had possibly died because of that trust. I understand the risks, she said, but if there's a chance to stop him, we have to take it. The Riverside Public Library's monthly mystery book club typically attracted 15 to 20 regular members, but for the October meeting, Agent Park had arranged for several additional participants to attend. 8 undercover FBI agents, posing as crime fiction enthusiasts, would be positioned throughout the meeting room to provide security and surveillance. Sarah arrived at the library 2 hours before the 7 p.m. meeting to help set up the room and coordinate with the surveillance team. The meeting room was on the ground floor, with large windows facing the street and 2 exits, one leading to the main library area and another providing direct access to the parking lot. Agent Rodriguez briefed Sarah on the tactical setup while they arranged chairs in a circle for the book discussion. We have agents positioned as participants inside the room, plainclothes officers in the parking lot, and surveillance teams monitoring all entrances. If Morrison shows up, we'll be ready. What's the plan if he tries to leave with me or another participant? Sarah asked. He won't get the chance. The moment he makes any threatening move, we'll move in. But Sarah, remember that your job is to gather intelligence, not to apprehend a suspect. Let us handle the tactical response. At 6:45 p.m., regular book club members began arriving. Sarah greeted each of them normally, trying to maintain the casual atmosphere that characterized their monthly discussions. Mrs. Peterson, a retired English teacher who had been coming to the book club for 5 years, noticed Sarah's apparent nervousness. Are you feeling all right, dear? You seem a bit on edge tonight. Just excited about tonight's discussion, Sarah replied. We have some new members joining us. At exactly 7 p.m., Robert Morrison walked into the meeting room. He had dressed more casually than during his previous library visit, wearing khakis and a polo shirt that made him look like any other suburban book club participant. But Sarah noticed that his eyes immediately scanned the room, cataloging faces and exits with the systematic attention of someone conducting surveillance. Mr. Morrison, glad you could make it, Sarah said, gesturing to an empty chair. Everyone, we have a new member joining us tonight. Mrs. Robert Morrison took his seat and smiled at the group. Thank you for letting me participate. I'm looking forward to discussing some great crime fiction with fellow enthusiasts. The book club was discussing Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn, a psychological thriller about a marriage that turns deadly when the wife disappears under suspicious circumstances. As the discussion progressed, Sarah noticed that Morrison's contributions were unusually insightful about the criminal psychology aspects of the story. The husband's behavior during the investigation is particularly interesting, Morrison commented. The way he presents himself to the media, His apparent lack of emotional response to his wife's disappearance, it's classic narcissistic behavior. Someone with that personality type would feel superior to both the investigators and the public, confident that he can manipulate the narrative. Dr. Forster, who was participating in the book club as an undercover agent posing as a psychology professor, picked up on Morrison's comment. "You seem to have a good understanding of criminal psychology. Have you studied it professionally?" Morrison's smile became more guarded. "Just a personal interest. I find the psychology of criminals fascinating. How they select victims, how they evade detection, how they interact with law enforcement." As the discussion continued, Sarah noticed that Morrison was paying particular attention to the female participants, especially those who mentioned living alone or having limited family connections. When Mrs. Peterson mentioned that her husband had passed away 3 years ago and she lived by herself with just her cat, Morrison asked several follow-up questions about her daily routine and neighborhood. "It must get lonely sometimes," Morrison said to Mrs. Peterson. "Do you have family nearby? My daughter lives in Seattle, so I don't see her very often. The library and this book club are really my main social activities." Sarah watched Morrison's face as he absorbed this information, noting the subtle shift in his expression that suggested he was filing away details for future reference. After the official book discussion ended at 8:30 p.m., several participants lingered to continue informal conversations. Morrison approached Sarah as she was cleaning up the meeting room. "Thank you for a wonderful discussion," he said. "I was wondering if you might be interested in continuing our conversation over coffee sometime. I'd love to hear more about your insights into criminal psychology." Sarah felt every nerve in her body go on high alert. This was exactly the type of approach the task force had predicted, an attempt to isolate her from the group setting and gather more personal information. "That's very kind of you," Sarah replied carefully. "But I'm pretty busy with work and other commitments." Morrison's smile remained fixed, but Sarah noticed a flash of something darker in his eyes. "Of course, perhaps another time." As the last participants left the meeting room, Sarah began shutting down the lights and locking up. Through her earpiece, she heard Agent Rodriguez's voice. "Morrison just left the building and is walking toward the parking lot. Agent Williams is maintaining visual contact." Sarah finished her closing routine and walked toward the main library exit, where Agent Johnson was waiting to escort her to a car. As they stepped outside, Agent Rodriguez's voice came through the earpiece again, but this time with urgent intensity. "All units. Morrison is not going to his vehicle. He's circling back toward the building. Sarah, do not go to your car. Get back inside immediately." Sarah and Agent Johnson immediately turned around and headed back toward the library entrance. As they reached the door, Sarah glanced over her shoulder and saw Morrison emerging from behind a row of parked cars, moving quickly in their direction. "FBI, stop where you are," Agent Williams shouted from across the parking lot. Morrison froze for a moment, then suddenly sprinted toward the street where a dark sedan was waiting with its engine running. Multiple FBI agents converged on his position, but Morrison reached the car and jumped into the passenger seat before they could intercept him. The sedan accelerated rapidly away from the library, with FBI pursuit vehicles immediately giving chase. Agent Rodriguez's voice came through the radio. "Suspect vehicle is a black BMW sedan. License plate obscured, heading north on MLK Boulevard. All units in pursuit." Sarah stood in the library doorway with Agent Johnson, her heart pounding as she watched the tail lights of the pursuit vehicles disappear into the night. She realized that she had just come face to face with a serial killer who had been planning to add her to his list of victims. The chase and CAPTURV pursuit of Morrison's vehicle led through downtown Portland at speeds that forced FBI agents to coordinate with local police to block intersections and prevent civilian casualties. The chase lasted only 12 minutes, but it ended dramatically when Morrison's driver attempted to make a high-speed turn onto the steel bridge and lost control of the vehicle. The BMW crashed through a barrier and came to rest against a concrete support pillar. Morrison was pulled unconscious from the wreckage and transported to Oregon Health and Science University Hospital under heavy police guard. The driver, who turned out to be Morrison's younger brother, was pronounced dead at the scene. Agent Park called Sarah at home at 11:30 p.m. with an update. "Morrison is in critical condition but stable. We found a trunk full of evidence in the BMW driver's licenses from multiple victims, personal items that appear to be trophies, and detailed surveillance notes about library patrons from across 3 states. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and horror, relief that the killer had been caught, and horror at the confirmation that her worst fears had been correct. Was he planning to target more people from tonight's book club? Based on the notes we found, yes. He had detailed information about Mrs. Peterson, including her address, daily routine, and the fact that she lives alone. There were also notes about 2 other book club members. Sarah closed her eyes, imagining what might have happened if the FBI task force hadn't been monitoring Morrison's activities. Mrs. Peterson and possibly other innocent people would have to become victims of a predator who had used Sarah's library as a hunting ground. What about the other missing people? Mrs. Peterson, David Kim, Jennifer Walsh. Agent Park's voice was grim. We are still analyzing the evidence, but based on what we found so far, we believe Morrison was responsible for all 23 disappearances. We're working with local authorities to begin recovery operations. Over the following weeks, the investigation revealed the full scope of Morrison's crimes. His real name was David Allen Morrison, a 42-year-old former social worker who had been fired from multiple positions for inappropriate behavior with clients. He had been operating across 3 states for over 2 years, using public libraries to identify and stalk potential victims. Morrison's method had been to spend weeks observing library patrons, identifying those who appeared socially isolated and vulnerable. He would then approach them outside the library, often posing as someone conducting research or surveys, and convince them to accompany him to a secondary location where he would kill them. The evidence recovered from his vehicle and his apartment revealed that he had kept detailed files on hundreds of potential victims, including photographs, daily schedules, and personal information gathered through casual conversations. Sarah's library patrons, Mrs. Peterson, David Kim, and Jennifer Walsh, had been among his most recent victims. Morrison survived his injuries but remained in a coma for 6 weeks before regaining consciousness. When he was finally able to be interviewed, he confessed to all 23 murders and provided information that led investigators to the locations where he had disposed of the bodies. Mrs. Peterson, David Kim, and Jennifer Walsh were found, buried in a remote wooded area outside Portland, along with 20 other victims from across the Pacific Northwest. Their families were finally able to have closure and provide proper burials for their loved ones. Morrison was charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder in 3 states. Given the overwhelming evidence against him and his detailed confessions, he accepted a plea agreement that resulted in life imprisonment without the possibility of parole in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. For Sarah, the resolution of the case brought mixed emotions. She was grateful that Morrison had been stopped before he could kill again, and she found satisfaction in knowing that her profiling skills had been instrumental in his capture. But she also struggled with guilt about the role her library had played in his victim selection process. "You couldn't have known," Agent Rodriguez told her during one of their post-case debriefs. "Morrison was a highly skilled predator who would have found victims regardless of where he hunted. The fact that he used your library doesn't make you responsible for his crimes." Dr. Foster, the forensic psychologist who had worked on the task force, offered a different perspective. "Your identification of the pattern probably saved dozens of lives. Morrison was escalating rapidly, and if we hadn't caught him when we did, he would have continued killing at an accelerating pace." The case received extensive media coverage, but Sarah managed to avoid most of the attention by declining interview requests and maintaining her privacy. The FBI credited her contributions to the investigation but respected her desire to return to her quiet life as a librarian. 6 months after Morrison's capture, Sarah stood in the crime fiction section of the Riverside Public Library, helping a patron select her next book. The library had returned to its normal routine, and the community had gradually healed from the trauma of discovering that their quiet sanctuary had been used as a hunting ground by a serial killer. "I really enjoyed the last book you recommended," the patron said. "Do you have anything similar?" Sarah smiled and pulled a book from the shelf. "I think you'd like this one. It's a psychological thriller about a detective who has to confront her own past to solve a case." As the patron walked away with her selection, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed over the past year. The Morrison case had forced her to confront the reality that she would never completely leave her FBI career behind. Her profiling skills were an integral part of who she was, and trying to suppress them had been both futile and potentially dangerous. But she had also learned that those skills could be used in positive ways that didn't require her to return to the full-time stress and trauma of federal law enforcement. She had begun consulting part-time with the FBI on cold cases and missing persons investigations, using her expertise to help solve crimes while maintaining her primary role as a librarian. The library had also implemented new security procedures and staff training programs to help identify potentially dangerous patrons. Sarah had worked with local law enforcement to develop guidelines for recognizing suspicious behavior and reporting concerns. Most importantly, Sarah had found a way to honor the memory of Morrison's victims by ensuring that their deaths had meaning. She had established a memorial reading garden behind the library, with benches dedicated to Mrs. Peterson, David Kim, Jennifer Walsh, and the other victims. Their families had participated in the dedication ceremony, finding some comfort in knowing that their loved ones were remembered in a place dedicated to learning and community. Agent Rodriguez visited Sarah occasionally when his FBI duties brought him to Portland. During one of these visits, he asked her if she ever regretted leaving the bureau. "I don't regret leaving," Sarah replied, "but I also don't regret coming back when I was needed. I think I've found the right balance between using my skills to help people and maintaining the peaceful life I built here." And if another case like Morrison comes up, Sarah looked around the library at the patrons, reading quietly at oak tables, at the children attending story time, at the community she had sworn to protect. "Then I'll be ready," she said. The story of Dr. Sarah Chen reminds us that our past experiences and skills never truly leave us, even when we try to start over in a completely different career. Her 20 years as an FBI profiler had given her insights into human behavior that made her an exceptional librarian. But they also carried responsibilities that she couldn't ignore when people's lives were at stake. Sarah's journey also illustrates the importance of trusting our instincts and taking action when we recognize patterns that others might miss. Her willingness to re-engage with law enforcement and risk her personal safety likely saved dozens of lives and brought closure to the families of Morrison's victims. The case demonstrates how predators often hide in plain sight, using trusted institutions and public spaces to identify and target vulnerable individuals. Libraries, with their welcoming atmosphere and regular patron interactions, can become hunting grounds for those who understand how to exploit social connections and community trust. But Sarah's story also shows how the same institutions can become sources of protection when staffed by people who understand the signs of danger and are willing to act on their concerns. Her combination of academic knowledge, practical experience, and genuine care for her community made her uniquely qualified to recognize and respond to Morrison's threat. Today, the Riverside Public Library continues to serve its community as a center of learning and intellectual freedom. Sarah remains as the head librarian, using her unique background to ensure that the library is both welcoming to all patrons and vigilant against those who would exploit its openness for harmful purposes. Her office still contains the same sparse decorations it always had, but now there's a small framed photograph on her desk, a picture of the Memorial Reading Garden, with its benches dedicated to Morrison's victims. It serves as a daily reminder that knowledge and vigilance are the best defenses against those who would prey on the innocent. The crime fiction section of the library remains popular, and Sarah continues to provide recommendations that help patrons explore the psychology of criminals and the methods used to catch them. But now she does so with the knowledge that sometimes the most dangerous criminals aren't found in books. They're sitting quietly at the table next to you, waiting for the right moment to reveal their true nature. Have you ever met someone like Dr. Sarah Chen? Someone whose hidden expertise emerged when their community needed protection. Someone who used their professional skills to serve others, even when it meant confronting their own past. Share their story in the comments below, and let us know what city you're watching from. Here at the Soldier Stories, we believe that heroes come in many forms, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought by ordinary people with extraordinary knowledge. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it. Help us ensure that stories of courage, expertise, and community protection continue to inspire others to remain vigilant and ready to act when duty calls. We'll see you in the next story. Until then, remember that the quiet professionals sitting nearby might be carrying skills and experiences that could save your life. Sometimes the most dangerous predators hide in plain sight, but so do the protectors who stand ready to stop them.